For most of English history, if you were an unhappy wife, the law had a simple answer for you. There wasn't one. Divorce wasn't just difficult to get. For almost everyone, it was completely, legally impossible. And when ordinary people couldn't wait for a law that barely existed, some of them turned to something almost unbelievable instead. They sold their wives in public at the market with a rope around her neck. This is the history of what women actually did when they couldn't get a divorce, no matter what. Before 1857, ending a marriage in England required something almost nobody could realistically obtain: a private act of Parliament. Not a court filing, not a judge's ruling in an ordinary courtroom. An actual individual law written specifically for one couple, debated and voted on by the entire British government just to dissolve a single marriage. The process cost somewhere between £1,000 and £1,200, an almost unimaginable fortune for the average family at the time, putting it completely out of reach for anyone outside the wealthiest handful of families in the entire country. Across the whole 18th and 19th centuries combined, only around 300 of these parliamentary divorces were ever granted in total, and the process was almost exclusively available to men. Historians have found only a small handful of cases where a woman successfully petitioned for one herself. A woman seeking one faced a legal system that assumed, by default and without exception, that she had no independent legal existence at all, separate from her husband. That assumption had a specific legal name: coverture. Under English common law, when a woman married, her separate legal identity was considered legally absorbed entirely into her husband's, as though the two people had merged into a single legal entity with only one voice that counted. She couldn't own property in her own name, even property she'd inherited or earned herself before marriage. She couldn't sign contracts independently, or keep her own wages if she worked. Her money, her wages, her body, and her children were all, legally speaking, his to control. One reformer of the era described a separated wife's position bluntly and without exaggeration, calling her homeless, helpless, and almost destitute of civil rights. If your husband turned violent or unfaithful or simply cruel and controlling, the law offered you almost nothing to work with and very few places to turn. So what did ordinary women and their husbands actually do? For the poorest couples in England, a strange, entirely informal custom developed instead, one that never had any real legal standing whatsoever and yet persisted for well over a century. Wife selling. A husband and wife, having mutually agreed between themselves that their marriage was over, would walk together to the local market, sometimes the very same market ordinarily used for selling livestock and cattle. He would place a rope or halter around her neck or waist, lead her up onto a stand in full public view, and openly auction her off to the highest bidder, often a man she had already quietly chosen herself well beforehand, with the whole event prearranged. Once the sale was complete, witnessed by a public crowd, the old marriage was considered informally dissolved by community consensus, and the buyer took on financial responsibility for her from that point forward, as though a genuine legal transfer had occurred. It wasn't legal in any formal sense. It was never sanctioned by the church or the courts, and technically existed in a complete legal gray area. But local authorities frequently looked the other way regardless, largely because they had no better, more accessible alternative to offer the poor. Historians have documented close to 400 of these sales between the mid-1700s and the early 1900s, a number roughly comparable to the formal parliamentary divorces granted to the wealthy across that exact same stretch of time. In 1826, a man named John Turton sold his wife Mary to a man named William Kay for 5 shillings at a market in Emley Cross. As recently as 1913, a woman in Leeds told a police court she'd been sold to one of her own husband's colleagues for £1. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what history conveniently left out of the textbooks, hit subscribe now. We dig up stories exactly like this one every single week. For women with slightly more social standing, but still no real legal power of their own, the story looked different, and one woman's personal fight against the system ended up changing everything that came after her. Her name was Caroline Norton, a published author and society figure. In the 1830s, she left her abusive husband, George Norton, after years of documented violence. Under English law at the time, she had no right to divorce him at all, no right to keep the earnings from her own published writing, and, most devastatingly of all, absolutely no legal right to her own 3 children. In her own words, written afterward and later published, she described exactly what she was told by the legal system she turned to for help. I could not plead cruelty, which I had forgiven, that by returning to Mr. Norton, I had condoned all I complained of. I learnt, too, the law as to my children, that the right was with the father, that neither my innocence nor his guilt could alter it, that not even his giving them into the hands of a mistress would give me any claim to their custody. Her 3 sons were 6, 4, and 2.5 years old when she was separated from them completely, with no legal path back to them whatsoever, regardless of what her husband had done or was continuing to do. Caroline Norton refused to simply accept this. She wrote pamphlets. She petitioned Parliament directly, using her own devastating story as evidence. In 1839, her efforts directly resulted in the Custody of Infants Act, finally giving separated mothers the right to petition for custody of children under 7, the very first real crack in a legal wall that had stood for centuries. Her work didn't stop there. Norton spent the next 2 decades campaigning relentlessly for broader reform, working alongside other women reformers like Barbara Lee Smith, who gathered a petition with 26,000 signatures demanding change. Together, their pressure directly shaped the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, which finally created a real civil divorce court in England for the first time in the nation's history, removing the requirement for an individual Act of Parliament entirely. But even this landmark reform came with a built-in double standard that should make you genuinely angry. A husband could obtain a divorce simply by proving his wife had committed adultery, a single accusation, nothing more required. A wife, on the other hand, had to prove adultery plus something additional entirely on top of it, cruelty, desertion, bigamy, or incest, before any court would even consider granting her the exact same outcome. The law had moved, undeniably. It hadn't moved anywhere close to equally, and everyone involved in writing it knew that perfectly well at the time. So here's the twist worth sitting with. The 1857 Act is usually remembered simply as the moment England created modern divorce. What it actually represented was decades of a woman's very specific personal suffering, turned deliberately into public political pressure, forcing lawmakers who had never faced any of it themselves to finally act, if only partially, and only after being publicly shamed into it by one woman's writing. Full equality still took generations longer to arrive. That same double standard, adultery alone for men, adultery plus additional proof for women, remained written into British law for decades after 1857. Genuine legal equality in divorce wasn't achieved until well into the 20th century. And in some countries around the world today, meaningful barriers to a woman's right to divorce still exist in some form. Think about the full arc of this story. Poor women sold at the market with a rope around their necks, simply because no legal alternative existed for people without money. A wealthy woman denied any legal claim to her own 3 children, despite her husband's proven violence and infidelity. And one woman's personal grief turned into pamphlets, petitions, and ultimately into law, cracking open a system that had insisted, for centuries, that a wife simply wasn't a full legal person at all. Next time you hear someone mention filing paperwork for a routine divorce, remember exactly how recently that simple, ordinary option didn't exist at all, for almost anyone. If nobody ever taught you Caroline Norton's name, imagine how many other women like her never made it into the history books at all. Subscribe if you want more of these stories, and tell me in the comments if you'd ever heard of wife selling before today. I read every single one. Next week, we're uncovering why women's asylums were quietly filled with patients who were never actually sick at all.